It is a still night in the English countryside. The moon hangs pale above an ancient castle, its battlements softened by fog. The fire in the main hall has dulled to a low amber glow, casting flickering shadows across worn stone walls. In this, quiet, when the revelry has died and the nobles have retreated to feather beds, a lone figure sits on a narrow stool, slowly peeling away layers of performance. A painted smile, once red and bright, now smudges into his handkerchief. Beneath the colors, his face is neither tragic nor joyful, merely tired. This is the jester, and he is finally alone. To modern ears, the word jester may conjure the image of a happy fool, tumbling, joking, capering about in a hat with bells, delighting royalty and peasants alike. But reality, as it often does, wears a darker cloak. To be a jester in the medieval court was, in truth, to live a life wrapped in contradiction, at once cherished and ridiculed, free to speak yet bound by unspoken rules, visible to all yet emotionally invisible. It was a role that demanded everything: cleverness, endurance, emotional control, and above all the ability to make someone laugh, even when the world offered little reason to smile. Let us go back to where it often began, not in celebration, but in selection. Many jesters did not choose their profession. Some were born with physical deformities or cognitive differences, and in a society that prized conformity and distrusted difference, these individuals were often seen not as people but as curiosities, as natural fools. A child born with dwarfism or an unusual gait might be taken, not to be nurtured but to be presented at court. Laughter would follow, not laughter at wit, but laughter at difference. Others were what chroniclers called artificial fools, men who learned the art of jesting through performance. They were actors, poets, mimics, and musicians who developed their craft to entertain and to survive. These were often clever men, deeply observant, attuned to the quirks and moods of those around them. They could make light of war, poke fun at bishops, and turn royal scandal into a rhyme. But here lies the first truth of why it sucked, deeply, exhaustingly, to be a medieval jester. You had to be funny, every single day, without fail. In a court where favor was fragile and monarchs fickle, one poorly timed joke could ruin you. Worse, telling the truth, even wrapped in humor, could land you in the dungeon. The same quip that made the king laugh yesterday might anger him today. The line between amusement and offense was as thin as a thread, and often invisible. And yet, paradoxically, the jester was often the only one allowed to speak truth to power. He could mimic the king's gestures, mock his decisions, even ridicule his courtiers, things that, if said by a noble, might lead to beheading. But the jester had one shield: laughter. If he could make them laugh, he was safe. For now. But humor, as anyone who has wielded it knows, is not always a shield. Sometimes it is a knife. The emotional labor of being perpetually entertaining takes a toll, especially when the jester himself was not allowed to feel anything other than what the role demanded. No sorrow, no anger, no fatigue. Just the grin, the bells, the pratfalls, and the endless demand, make us laugh. There were no holidays from jesting, no sick leave. The court did not pause its demand for mirth just because the jester had lost a brother, or was nursing a cold, or had not eaten since dawn. Laughter was required. And so, many jesters learned to conceal everything: emotions, pain, exhaustion, beneath the mask of comedy, and make no mistake, it was a mask. One made of paint, of rhyme, of rehearsed chaos. Then there were the dangers of being too clever. Several jesters throughout history found themselves exiled, or worse, for jokes that struck too close to the royal ego. One notable tale tells of a jester who compared a king's greed to that of a pig rooting in the dirt. The court laughed. The king did not. By sunrise, the jester was gone. Some say to a monastery, others say to the river. The court jester was never truly safe. His proximity to power was both his protection and his peril. He walked among lords, dined among nobles, whispered in kings' ears, but he was never one of them. He was never quite trusted, always observed. He could be petted like a favored dog or kicked like a mangy stray depending on the day's mood, and yet despite it all, some jesters managed to leave their mark. Names like Will Sommers, the beloved fool of Henry VIII, or Triboulet, who served French kings with razor wit, flicker through history. These men understood the delicate art of survival through performance. They were not merely clowns. They were navigators of danger, wielding humor like a blade, soft and sharp. But most jesters, their names are lost, their lives unrecorded. They died without fanfare, buried in paupers' graves, their stories forgotten. The laughter they summoned lived only as echoes in the stone halls of vanished castles. Tonight, as the embers cool and the castle sleeps, the jester lies awake in his narrow bed. His hands, stained faintly by face paint, rest on his chest. He listens to the soft drip of rainwater in a distant gutter. In the stillness, he wonders who he is when the costume comes off. Whether anyone sees the man beneath the fool. Whether anyone ever did. He turns over. The bells on his hat tinkle slightly, from where they hang on the wall. Tomorrow he will put them on again. He must. Before the court jester donned his motley garb and jingled his way into the echoing chambers of power, the seeds of his strange profession were already taking root, in far older, and often stranger, soil. Long before medieval Europe coined the term fool, there were other figures who walked a similarly precarious line between humor and danger. From ancient Egypt to imperial China, from the royal palaces of the Mughal Empire to the tribal gatherings of West Africa, societies across the world cultivated a figure who could speak the unspeakable, cloaked in absurdity. In many of these cultures, this role carried both reverence and risk. He, or sometimes she, was not merely an entertainer. He was a truth-teller, a social safety valve, a living contradiction. Let us begin in the dusty courts of ancient Egypt. On the banks of the Nile, court entertainers called dwarfs of the god held high positions. Their stature, considered divine by association with certain gods, granted them unique access to royalty. They danced, sang, and made the pharaoh smile, but they also bore the weight of being seen more as symbols than humans. A curious mix of sacred and spectacle. Across the world, in the shadowed halls of the Chinese imperial palace, the yushi, or playful officials, were sometimes called upon to balance the stern bureaucracy with humor. Their task was not only to amuse but to challenge, subtly and with grace. The best among them were masters of timing, offering critiques wrapped in clever verse or harmless banter, poking holes in pomp without letting the air out completely. In the Yoruba kingdoms of West Africa, ritual clowns took on even more layered roles. Known for their erratic behavior during festivals, they would mock chiefs, flout customs, and perform outrageous acts, all under divine sanction. In doing so, they reminded everyone, even rulers, that pride had a limit and laughter could be sacred. So what does this global history tell us? It tells us that the jester, in one form or another, is an ancient archetype, perhaps as old as power itself. Wherever authority concentrates, somewhere nearby you will find the person who makes fun of it. But the European medieval jester, the one with the coxcomb hat and sarcastic grin, emerged in a more particular context. His ancestors were the minstrels and skalds, the traveling performers who carried news, stories, and satire across the countryside. They performed in taverns, public squares, and noble halls. They juggled, mimicked, recited poetry, and occasionally offended the wrong nobleman, which more often than not ended their careers rather abruptly. As feudalism deepened and courts became more permanent institutions, a need arose for someone to amuse the lord and his guests regularly. Someone clever, agile, and expendable. Thus the court jester was born. But here is the painful twist. Sometimes jesters were not chosen for their skill, but for their appearance. In a time when birth defects, deformities, and mental illness were poorly understood, and often feared, those who bore visible differences were either shunned or employed. If a child was unusually short, or had a distinct speech pattern, or could be taught to mimic animals or play the fool, He might be taken in not out of charity, but for amusement. There is an uneasy silence here, isn't there? A tension between laughter and exploitation. The jester was often someone who did not quite fit, and so he was reshaped to fit the whims of others. He might be trained in the art of satire, or taught to play the lute, or drilled in acrobatics. But beneath the training there was always this unstated message: you are here to serve our pleasure. If you forget that or cease to amuse, you are disposable. And so the role evolved, patch by patch, rhyme by rhyme. The costume itself is a clue. The bright, clashing colors of a jester's tunic were not chosen for elegance. They were a visual signal. This person is different. Not noble, not knight, not priest, something else, something other. The cap, often called the fool's coxcomb, mimicked a rooster's crest, a symbol of both foolishness and bravado. The bells served a double purpose. They signaled the jester's presence, and they made it impossible for him to slip away unnoticed. Imagine that, a job where even your quiet moments must jingle. And then there was the scepter, sometimes fashioned into a miniature version of the jester himself, his bauble. This little doll, often grotesque or exaggerated, allowed the jester to speak in a second voice. He could pretend it was the bauble mocking the duke, not him. It was a clever trick, a shield of ventriloquism against royal wrath. But cleverness was no armor against cruelty. There were jesters who were mocked by the very children of the court, jesters who were forced to perform humiliating acts for laughs, jesters who were beaten when their jokes fell flat. Behind the mask of mirth lay a constant awareness: I am here at their mercy. And yet, curiously, the jester was often the most emotionally intelligent person in the room. He had to be. His survival depended on reading expressions, anticipating moods, knowing when to tease and when to flatter. He was, in a strange way, a kind of court psychologist, diagnosing tension through timing, easing conflict through satire. Some monarchs came to depend on their jesters not merely for amusement, but for advice. Henry VIII, a famously volatile king, kept his jester Will Sommers close even through his worst tempers. Will, by all accounts, was no fool. He knew exactly how far he could push and exactly when to pull back. And so we return, tonight, to that quiet chamber in the keep where the fire has nearly gone out. The jester lies on his straw mattress, hat carefully folded beside him. His fingers twitch slightly, remembering the rhythm of today's performance, the applause, the laughter, the brief glance from the queen that said, "Well done." Outside, the wind picks up. Rain begins to patter against the shutters. Another day is coming. Another round of smiles, jokes, and tiptoeing across invisible lines. But for now, he sleeps. Not peacefully, perhaps, but deeply. Because even jesters need to dream. Dawn creeps softly through the narrow windows of the servants' quarters. Pale light spills across uneven stone floors and threadbare blankets. In a modest chamber tucked beside the kitchens, the jester awakens before the cock crows. Not because he is expected to, but because habit has trained him to greet the morning long before the court does. He sits up slowly, his limbs stiff from a night spent on straw. His first motion is not to stretch or pray or even sigh, but to reach for his bells. Today, like every day, he must be ready. Ready to entertain, to charm, to insult without offending. Ready to balance the invisible scales between humor and humiliation. His life depends on it. So what does a typical day look like for a medieval jester? One might imagine laughter and games, the stuff of children's books. But reality wore heavier robes. First comes the morning court. While nobles are just breaking their fast, the jester is already in motion, alert to every shifting mood. He watches how the lord stabs his eggs, angrily or playfully. He listens for tension in the voices of ministers. He senses instinctively whether today will be a day for subtle satire or slapstick nonsense. His toolkit is wide: mimicry, musical instruments, riddles, storytelling, physical comedy, even crude jokes when the setting allows. He must improvise constantly. A frown from a baron. He launches into a tale of a merchant who bought his own hat twice. A bored queen. He plays the lute with spoons for fingers. A quiet, brooding king. He dares gently to compare the monarch's face to that of his horse. If the room laughs, he lives. If it doesn't, the silence weighs heavier than armor. Between court sessions, he may be called privately to entertain a noble guest, or lighten the mood during tense negotiations. Sometimes jesters were used as conversational icebreakers, offering crude comic relief before serious discussions began. At other times, they were used to ridicule enemies, creating verses and songs mocking rival kings or unpopular lords. There is a strange irony here. Though the jester is often treated as lowly, a glorified pet in motley garb, he is also entrusted with secrets. He listens as ambassadors whisper behind tapestries. He watches as the bishop's hand lingers a little too long on the wine cup. He sees everything and remembers. This makes him both powerful and vulnerable. A slip of the tongue, a misplaced joke about the wrong affair or political scandal, and he risks far more than embarrassment. In some courts, jesters were tortured or executed for speaking truths that hit too close to home. They were given leeway, but not immunity. After lunch, the jester may be asked to perform for the children of the court. This is often more tiring than the royal court itself. Children, unlike nobles, are less polite about boredom. They heckle, they demand, they tug at his sleeves. The jester responds with juggling, puppetry, riddles, and playful insults. He endures, it all with a strained grin. But even here, among the little ones, he must be careful. One careless jest about a child's appearance, one clumsy joke that makes a young prince cry and he could lose his station. Royal children are still royal. After all, by late afternoon he may be given a brief respite. He retires to his chamber where he changes out of his sweat-dampened motley. He drinks water, sometimes wine, if the steward is generous. If he's lucky, he might rest for an hour or two. But rest never truly comes. He is always on, even in quiet moments. Because jesters are not just performers, they are property. In the evening, the great hall awakens again. Torches blaze. Musicians tune their instruments. The nobles dine on meats and spiced wines, and once again the jester is summoned. Here the performance changes. Dinner entertainment is more elaborate and more dangerous. As wine flows and inhibitions loosen, laughter becomes louder and more demanding. The jester must now navigate drunken nobles, flirtatious ladies, and a king who might demand a mockery of the bishop who sits 5 chairs away. He sings ballads laced with double meanings. He performs short plays, often featuring himself as the butt of the joke. He may even be challenged to insult battles, a common medieval game where wit must cut, but never wound too deep. Tonight, a noble dares him. Mock the queen's latest tapestry. The hall quiets. The jester knows the queen spent 3 months on that tapestry. He also knows her pride is as delicate as spun glass. He responds carefully. "My lady, your tapestry is so fine. Even the mice line up to read it." A ripple of laughter. The queen smirks. The moment passes. He has survived. When the feasting ends and the nobles stagger off to bed or intrigue, the jester retreats again to his quarters. He undresses slowly, wiping grease from his cheeks and wine from his sleeves. He counts the bruises from tonight's tumbles. He winces at a twisted ankle. There is no physician for the fool. Only sleep and tomorrow. And still, before lying down, he picks up his hat, that absurd jingling thing, and places it neatly by his bed, not out of love but respect. The hat has saved him again today. It has hidden his weariness, his opinions, his aching bones. Tomorrow, it will do so again. Some jesters grow old. They lose teeth, forget verses, limp more than dance. If they are lucky, they are kept on out of loyalty or nostalgia. If not, they are quietly dismissed, replaced, forgotten. The world has little memory for those whose job is to make it forget its troubles. And yet, in the silence of his small room, the jester allows himself one small smile, because today at least they laughed, and as long as they laugh, he still belongs. The great hall of the castle is roaring again. Laughter rolls across the high beams like thunder in summer. Nobles wipe tears of mirth from their eyes as the jester stumbles, performs a mock feint, then springs up again with exaggerated surprise. The musicians strike a lively tune. Cups are raised. Another toast. Another jest. At the center of it all is the jester, spinning, bowing, grinning. He is the life of the feast, the spark in the royal fireplace, the one who breaks the silence with absurdity, who mends tension with clever mimicry, who draws a reluctant chuckle even from the sourest of faces. But what happens when the hall quiets? When the laughter ends and the torches are doused one by one? That is when we glimpse the loneliest man at the banquet. To serve as a jester is to be ever present and yet profoundly unseen. Not in the physical sense, for everyone sees the fool. His hat alone ensures he is impossible to miss, but emotionally he remains a stranger, even to those who see him daily. He is welcomed at every table and yet has no true seat of his own. In the castle's social hierarchy, he floats in limbo. Not quite a servant, not quite a noble, not quite free, not quite enslaved. This in-between status may sound freeing to some, but in truth it is its own kind of prison, because he belongs to everyone and to no one. A servant may find companionship among other servants. A noble has family and alliances. But the jester? He cannot confide in the kitchen boy for fear his words are repeated. He cannot weep before the queen, for his role is to make her forget sorrow. He cannot even show irritation to a stable hand, lest a noble overhear and accuse him of disrespect. So he smiles, always. The painted smile, the habitual grin, the little nods of amusement. These are his armor, and behind them, a quiet ache. There are moments rare and fleeting when he is alone in the garden or chapel, and his mask drops. He sits on a stone bench, hat in hand, and watches birds pecking at crumbs. He wonders what it would be like to live unnoticed, to rise with the sun, walk to the market, choose pears, chat idly with a neighbor, and return home to a wife who does not expect a performance. He wonders, too, if he even knows how to stop performing, because the role of a jester seeps into the bones. Over time, he begins to second-guess even his real emotions. Is that a genuine laugh from his own mouth, or is it reflex? Does he cry because he is truly moved, or because he knows how tears are supposed to fall? Is he still a man beneath the motley, or only the character he plays? These are the thoughts that visit him in the quiet hours after the wine has settled and the music has faded. And then there is the matter of love. The jester may pine, like any man. He may find himself enchanted by the curve of a smile, the way a candle flame reflects in a chambermaid's eye, or the rare kindness of a duchess who once laughed not at his jest, but at the person he was behind it. But love, real, mutual, unmasked love, is perilous. If he confesses affection to someone above his station, he risks mockery or banishment. If he falls for someone within reach, they may not believe his feelings are sincere. After all, is he not always playing, always performing? And what of those who fall for him? They too must wrestle with the fear. Is this affection? Or is this just another act? There are a few tales, half fact, half wishful fiction, of jesters who found love. A quiet hand held beneath a banquet table, a private lullaby sung in a forgotten corridor. But more often, their stories end in distance, unspoken longing, a goodbye cloaked in jest. This emotional solitude is perhaps the greatest burden of the jester's life. He is the keeper of laughter, yet carries a well of silence within him. He watches others form bonds, families, loyalties, while he remains, the ever-circling moon, reflecting joy but never truly sharing in it. Even friendship is tricky. He may be close to the king, even trusted, but never entirely embraced. Royalty is a cruel friend. Their affection is real, but conditional. The moment the jester fails to amuse or stumbles into offense, he may find the door to the throne room shut. Forever. Among the courtiers he is admired but not included. They invite him to laugh with them, but never to weep among them. He is there for their leisure, not their lives, and among the servants he is envied, for he eats better, sleeps warmer, walks beside nobles. But this envy builds walls where bridges should be, so the jester walks alone, in the corridors of the castle, in the gardens after dusk, on the edge of every gathering, always near, never part. And yet, he endures. Because there is something strangely noble in what he does. He brings levity where there is tension. He softens wrath. He carries the weight of others' moods and transforms them into laughter. He takes the invisible heaviness of court life and makes it, for a moment, lighter. And maybe, just maybe, in doing so, he saves others from loneliness too. So tonight, as the stars prick the velvet sky and the torches dim one by one, the jester returns to his chamber. He does not cry. He does not sigh. He simply places his hat on the stool, washes his face, and folds his hands behind his head. And somewhere deep in the silence, he smiles. Not for show, not for duty, but because in his quiet way, he knows he matters, even if no one says it aloud. In the grand pageantry of court life, where robes shimmer and candles drip like melted gold, where words are chosen with the precision of a swordsman's strike, the jester alone speaks with reckless abandon, or so it seems. He mocks the bishops, waistline lampoons the steward's stinginess, mimics the queen's accent with unrepentant flair, all while the court erupts in laughter. He is the fool, the licensed lunatic, the harmless caperer. He wears no title, but brings down dukes with his rhymes. He holds no sword, yet leaves barons stinging from barbed wit. And yet, beneath the veil of absurdity, a constant tension coils tight within him. Because even as he dances and jokes and juggles his words, the jester is acutely aware he is one wrong syllable away from the scaffold. This is the paradox of the fool. He has the most dangerous freedom in the entire kingdom. He can say what others dare not, but only as long as it's funny. Only as long as it pleases. Only as long as it doesn't strike too deep. There is no written law that protects him. His protection is entirely informal, a courtesy, a tradition, a habit of tolerance that can vanish in the space of a single frown. Every jester knows of another who went too far. There was the fool who joked that the queen's dog had more noble blood than her cousin. The court laughed. The cousin did not. The next morning, the jester's bed was cold and his cell locked from the outside. Or the jester who sang a satirical ballad about a bishop's bribes, setting the lyrics to a familiar hymn. The irony was exquisite. The bishop's rage, biblical. The jester was sent to a monastery for contemplation, never to return. In the court, words are weapons, and the jester is a swordsman with no armor. He sharpens his tongue daily, rehearsing insults that sting just enough to amuse but not enough to offend. He watches eyes like a hawk, the subtle twitch of a cheek, the lift of a brow, the narrowing of a gaze. Each tells him how far he can go. Each is a signal. Push, here, or step back. He must also remember alliances. Which lords are at odds? Which ones are in favor? Who is nursing a slight or wielding a grudge? One careless jab can reopen a political wound. In this dance of daggers, humor is his shield. But shields can crack. That's why jesters often cloak their sharpest truths in layers, using allegory, rhyme, and misdirection. A jester might tell a tale about a pig and a fox and everyone laughs, pretending it's about animals. But everyone knows the pig is Lord Henrik, and the fox is the king. And the king, if he's wise, chuckles knowingly, acknowledging the critique without needing to say so. But kings are not always wise. Some are volatile. Some are proud. Some are weary from war, or wounded by betrayal, or simply in no mood to laugh. And a jester, no matter how skilled, cannot always predict which king will sit on the throne that day. So he tiptoes. He crafts jokes with the care of a monk illuminating manuscripts. He weaves truth into humor like poison into honey. He knows that satire, if wielded correctly, can soothe even as it stings. But wield it poorly, and it cuts the wielder first. This fragile privilege, the freedom to mock, gives the jester a peculiar power. Nobles may fear him, not because he holds office or lands, but because he holds words. He can shape how the court sees them. He can reduce a man's reputation to ashes with a single story well told. There are whispers always, that some jesters were more than they appeared. Spies, perhaps. After all, who better to overhear secrets than the man everyone forgets is in the room? Who better to observe and report than the one always watching, always listening, always smiling? And who better to be suspected, blamed, punished? Because a jester has no allies in high places. No family coat of arms, no lineage to defend him. If he is accused, few will defend him. After all, he was just the fool. There were jesters who were imprisoned not for what they said, but for what they were feared to know. There were jesters tortured to reveal who they'd been speaking to, or what they'd overheard while pouring wine or rehearsing verses in the garden. There was a jester in the court of Hungary who was believed to have overheard a conspiracy. He vanished for 3 months. When he returned, he never spoke again. Whether by choice or by injury, no one knew. And still, the jesters continued. Because even amid the danger, there was a strange dignity in what they did. They held up a mirror to the powerful and distorted it just enough to make it bearable. They voiced the people's frustrations in a form that could be laughed at rather than punished. They revealed the absurdity of court life, its vanities, its hypocrisies, its constant posturing. And sometimes, in the quiet after a good jest, even the king would smile. Not just at the fool, but at the truth beneath the fool's words. So, tonight as the jester practices his lines by candlelight, he pauses. He looks at the page. It is a poem about a wolf who pretends to be a sheepdog, about how the sheep cheer, even as they are led to the butcher. He considers performing it. Tomorrow, it is sharp, timely, risky. He folds the page in half and tucks it under his mattress. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But he sleeps a little easier knowing he can say it, someday, if the time is right. Because that is the jester's true gift. Not just to laugh in the face of danger, but to make danger laugh back. In a world where parchment was precious and memory fickle, the jester, oddly enough, became something of a historian. Not the kind who penned chronicles or copied royal decrees in gold-trimmed manuscripts. No, his history was oral, colored, exaggerated, and rhythmic. He was no clerk. He was the living memory of court life, wearing bells and speaking in riddles. This may come as a surprise. After all, who would trust the fool to remember anything accurately? And yet he did. Because while others schemed and postured and retold events to suit their ambitions, the jester, sidelined though he was, saw things from a peculiar angle. He had no estates to gain, no family name to defend. He was not rewriting events to look noble. He was watching, absorbing, storing stories for a rainy day. And he remembered everything. He remembered which baron once stumbled into the moat after too much mead and which lady once sang to a goose believing it was a cursed prince. He recalled the year of bad harvests and the way the steward tried to hide the grain. He remembered the change in the king's voice after the war, how it lowered and thickened and grew bitter at the edges. More importantly, he remembered what could not be written. The jester's tales preserved the soul of court life, not its official record. He was a walking archive of the unspoken and the uncomfortable. Where a monk might list dates and treaties, the jester would sing a bawdy song about how the chancellor lost his wig during a storm. Where a court clerk might copy a speech of triumph, the jester would mimic how the general nearly fainted from heat in his armor. These weren't just jokes. They were footnotes of truth told sideways. And sometimes, just sometimes, the jester's version was closer to reality than any scroll could offer, because everyone lies, or at least edits. But the jester? He lied in ways that revealed, rather than obscured. And so it was that over time kings and courtiers came to value the jester's memory. In private they might say, "Tell me again how Lord Eton tried to court the Danish princess." And the jester, grinning, would recite the tale, in rhyme no less, complete with the baron's trembling knees and woeful lute playing. More than entertainment, these stories became reference points, cultural bookmarks, a way of remembering who had done what and when, and how terribly they had done it. In courts where chroniclers were silenced, the jester's stories kept some version of truth alive. This was especially valuable in turbulent times. When one ruler fell and another rose, when names were scrubbed from records and faces disappeared from portraits, the jester still remembered. He might not speak it openly, but he carried it within. This made him quietly dangerous, and quietly powerful, because memory is power, especially in places where forgetting is convenient. Imagine a feast, years after a bloody purge. The hall is bright, the king cheerful, the guests well-fed. And then, the jester, under his breath, mutters to a passing servant, "Strange how empty the southern benches look tonight, A harmless observation. Almost. But the servant remembers. The noble guests pretend not to hear. And the king, if he's sharp, understands. The fool has not forgotten. Neither should he. It is in this role that the jester becomes something more than a performer. He becomes the kingdom's conscience wrapped in fool's motley. He is not always thanked for it. Sometimes his reminders are met with stony silence. Other times they earn nervous chuckles. Once in a while they prompt quiet nods, subtle acknowledgments that not all history lives in books. There are moments, too, when the jester becomes a true storyteller, spinning whole sagas from fragments of court life. These performances often happen at night when the candles burn low and the audience is more intimate. He begins with a familiar figure, the cook, the knight, the maid, and builds a tale that is part memory, part myth. He exaggerates, yes, but never loses the core. And in these stories, a strange kind of healing happens. Laughter becomes a balm for old wounds. Ridicule becomes reflection. A knight once said after such a performance, "You make the years bearable, fool." To which the jester replied, "They are only unbearable if we forget them." And perhaps that is the heart of it. The jester is not merely a distraction. He is a recorder of absurdities, a keeper of emotional truths. He remembers how things felt, not just what occurred. He preserves the moods of rooms, the laughter that rang after a particularly risky joke, the silence that followed a king's rage, the look on a widow's face when the court toasted a man just buried. He stores these things not out of duty, but because no one else does. And when the court forgets, as it often does, he remembers. So tonight, long after the fire has dimmed, the jester sits in his narrow room, humming an old verse about a pig who wanted to be pope. It's a ridiculous song, but it's based on something real, something that happened during the reign of the last monarch, a scandal now buried. A man who wore robes too fine, who bought blessings with gold. Only the jester remembers, and someday someone will ask, and he will smile and say, "Ah yes, that tale. Let me tell you how it truly went." In the painted halls of power, where loyalty is rare and flattery is the native tongue, there exists a peculiar bond, one stranger than brotherhood, more fragile than marriage, and infinitely more dangerous than either. It is the bond between a king and his fool. From the outside it appears whimsical. The king roars with laughter as the jester makes light of war, taxes, or aging queens. The jester mocks the monarch's gout, his vanity, even his ill-fated poems. Courtiers chuckle nervously, unsure whether to laugh or hide, but look closer. See the way the jester's eyes flick toward the king after every jest, gauging, testing, reading the royal weather. Observe the momentary stillness when a joke cuts, a little too near the bone. Hear the brief silence before the next laugh. It is not mere comedy being performed. It is negotiation. At the heart of it lies a paradox. The jester may be the only man in the kingdom who tells the king the truth, and yet He is also the easiest to kill. Kings have always needed someone to make them laugh. Perhaps because laughter, true and unfiltered, is rare for those who wear crowns. Surrounded by sycophants and spies, monarchs often find themselves in a prison of praise. Every decision is lauded, every flaw disguised. But the jester, if he's skilled, is a release. Valve, a pressure escape, a mirror that distorts just enough to be palatable. It is this service that earns him the king's trust, but it is a trust without guarantees. History offers many examples of jesters who rose to become royal confidants, only to fall with a single, or take Will Sommers, jester to Henry VIII. He served through wives and wars, outlasting many advisors. It was said the king could be in blackest temper, but Sommers could pierce it with one dry remark. Henry trusted him, even loved him, yet Sommers never forgot his place. He joked about ministers, not monarchs. He teased the queen's fashion, not her fertility. He danced on a narrow beam and survived. Not all were so fortunate. Triboulet, the jester of Francis III of France, once insulted a powerful noble. The noble demanded he be executed. The king, fond of his fool, offered a compromise. Triboulet could choose how he would die. With theatrical flair, Triboulet replied, "By old age." The king laughed. The noble fumed. Triboulet lived another day. It is in these exchanges and half play, half peril that we glimpse the deeper layers of this odd friendship. For kings, the jester represents a kind of relief. He says what no advisor dares. He mocks palace hypocrisies. He exposes truths so lightly that they seem weightless. But for the jester, the king is both protector and predator. He may shower the fool with wine, gifts, even a room near his own chambers. But he can also turn cold with a glance or decide, and on a whim, that the joke has gone too far. A jester once said, "To serve a king is to kiss a lion's teeth." And yet many jesters loved their kings, or believed they did. There are accounts of jesters weeping openly at the death of a monarch, refusing food, composing mournful verses in their honor. Was this love, or survival instinct disguised as sentiment? Perhaps it was both. Because in truth, the king was often the only person who saw the jester daily, who listened, who responded. Their conversations, however veiled in jest, were among the most honest. Exchanges in court. They shared a kind of intimacy, one built not on equality but on constant proximity. In some courts, the king would speak to no one before the fool. He would test the mood of the day by seeing what the jester brought. A joke about taxes might mean unrest. A jab at a baron's new boots could suggest a growing vanity problem. The jester became, in essence, a barometer for the kingdom's social weather. This gave him a strange influence, not official power. No lands, no armies, no votes in council, but influence that came from presence, from voice, from timing. He could nudge a king toward mercy with a tale about a farmer's starving child. He could plant seeds of doubt about a boastful general by mocking him as Sir Trumpet of Nowhere. He could soothe a monarch's grief with absurdity when no bishop's prayer would reach. And in return, he received safety, warmth, perhaps a cloak finer than his station deserved, perhaps meat at dinner rather than porridge, perhaps, on rare days, the sound of the king's true laughter, but never certainty, never permanence. A new monarch might find jesters distasteful and banish them altogether. A scandal, a rumor, even a dream could undo years of loyalty. And so the jester learns never to grow too comfortable. He keeps his hat clean. He practices new jokes in the dark. He watches the king's face at every utterance, measuring moods as a sailor measures the wind. He knows the friendship is real, but conditional. Tonight the jester performs for a quiet king, one who has not smiled in days. The hall is dimmer, the courtiers tense. The war has gone badly, the treasury is low. The jester knows this is a dangerous night, so he begins not with a joke, but with a gentle story about a baker who lost all his flour, but managed to make a cake from snow. The king listens. The courtiers frown, not sure if it's funny. Then comes the punchline, a quiet, ridiculous turn. and the king exhales something almost like a laugh. The tension breaks, the hall breathes again, and the jester bows, not deeply, but just enough to say, "For now, I have done my job." As he returns to his chamber, he thinks of all the kings who came before, the ones who laughed, the ones who scowled, the ones who forgot his name. He has outlived many, not by luck, but by understanding this truth. A king may rule a country, but a jester, he rules the king's laughter. And sometimes, just sometimes, that is the greater throne. In the minds of many, the jester is merely a clown, a slapstick buffoon flailing about in colorful rags, tripping over his own shoes for the amusement of bored nobles. But such an image, while not wholly false, is only a shadow of the full truth. The jester was not simply a figure of comedy. He was an artist, a craftsman of mood, a curator of chaos, and, perhaps above all, a master of timing. He had to be. Because laughter is not accidental. It is coaxed. It is crafted. And it is painfully difficult to summon on command, especially in a hall thick with politics, ambition, and suspicion. So the jester became a student of performance. He learned first the body, tumbling, flipping, balancing. He trained to move like a dancer, to fall like a feather, to cartwheel across the flagstones without injury or pause. Not every jester was an acrobat, but those who could leap and twist became favorites, especially among children or lords, drunk on wine and eager for spectacle. There were jesters who walked tightrope stretched across the great halls, who juggled knives while reciting rude poems, who could drop to a roll and spring up into a bow in a single fluid motion. And if he slipped, if he fell too hard, he had to make it funny. Turn the stumble into a pratfall, turn pain into punchline, always. Then there was the voice. Many jesters were singers. Some possessed clear, high tenors or rich baritones. They could sing love ballads, mockingly of course, or take a popular hymn and replace every third word with something scandalous. Others mastered impressions, mimicking the nasal drawl of the court treasurer or the fluttery falsetto of an overexcited baroness. A jester's tongue was as vital as his feet. Words mattered. Cadence mattered. A pause at just the right moment could make a decent joke unforgettable. And, oh, the instruments. Some jesters played the lute or the flute or the fiddle. Others used makeshift tools, pots, spoons, even dried animal bladders, to create percussive rhythms. They would accompany their verses with jingles and taps, creating layers of absurd music that seemed somehow perfectly timed. There were those who trained with trained animals, dogs dressed as bishops, monkeys who mimicked a knight's salute. The jester's show could be as elaborate or as simple as the court desired, but no matter the performance, it had to feel effortless, as if he just thought of it, as if he were chaos incarnate, not choreography. Of course, many of these skills were not innate. They were learned, and learned with difficulty. Imagine a boy, 10 years old, brought to court because he showed a knack for mimicry. He is handed to the jester, an older man who himself began as a mimic. The older fool becomes a tutor, strict, sly, and unrelenting. Never pause before a joke, he says. Never show pain unless you can turn it into a rhyme. And never, ever mock the queen's mother. So the boy learns. He practices falling until his knees are bruised. He repeats verses until he can recite them backward. He learns to smile while being pelted with bread rolls by bored lords. He learns to cry only in private and to turn every emotion into material. Over time, he becomes what the court desires, a living contradiction, a master of foolishness, a scholar of nonsense. And within this nonsense lies a hidden elegance. Because jesting, true jesting, is not aimless. It is deeply attuned to its audience. The jester reads the room as a painter reads a landscape. He adjusts his tones to fit the moment. A tense feast? He tells a tale of a nervous goose who became a general. A joyful wedding? He mimics the groom's strut with a wig and a walking stick. Every gesture is deliberate. Every silence is weighted. Even the props carry significance. The jester's scepter, his bauble, is often overlooked. But this strange, doll-like object was a tool of performance, shaped like a tiny caricature of the jester himself. The bauble allowed him to speak indirectly. If a comment was too sharp, too dangerous, he might let the bauble say it. "Ah," he would say, "little Jack here thinks the bishop's nose is large enough to host a sermon upon." The crowd laughs. The bishop glares. But it wasn't the jester who said it, you see. It was the bauble. This distancing was not just comedy. It was protection. And that, too, is part of the art. Jesters learn to protect themselves through humor, to wrap critiques in playfulness, to mock without threatening, to entertain without offending. It was an endlessly shifting balance, like juggling glass eggs. Some jesters wrote their own material. Others borrowed from traveling minstrels or adapted folk stories. But every tale, every song, every trick was reshaped to fit their unique stage, the unpredictable, candlelit world of the royal court. And though most jesters would never call themselves artists, would likely scoff at the idea, the truth is plain. They created joy from discomfort, humor from fear, humanity from hierarchy. That is art in its purest form. And so, late at night, when the hall is empty and the last song is ended, the jester returns to his quarters. He places his props carefully in a wooden chest. He oils his lute. He mutters the opening lines of tomorrow's story, not because anyone demands it, but because this too is survival, because the stage is always waiting, and so is the king. Strip away the costumes, the laughter, and the candle-lit halls, and one question lingers, as practical as it is poignant. What did the jester actually get in return? Was the fool rewarded handsomely for his services, showered with golden gowns, feasting at the king's right hand? Not exactly. To live as a jester in the medieval court was to occupy an odd position, one that promised visibility, but not necessarily comfort. While he might be at the very center of the court's attention during the day, when night fell, he often returned to the simplest of quarters. Let's begin with the basics. Where did the jester live? Most jesters were granted a modest chamber, within or just adjacent to the main castle. These rooms were often near the kitchens or the servant wings, close enough to be summoned quickly, but rarely luxurious. A small bed, a wash basin, a stool, and a place to store his costume and props were the usual fare. If he was fortunate, very fortunate, he might be granted a private fire in winter. But more often than not, he slept under a rough woolen blanket warmed by nothing but his own breath and the memory of the day's applause. And what did he eat? That too depended on favor. During performances or feasts, the jester might be allowed to eat scraps from the high table, slices of roast meat, a bit of sweet bread, the remains of a fine pie. But this was not guaranteed. On ordinary days, his meals resembled those of the lower servants: porridge, onions, cabbage stew, coarse bread. There are records of some jesters being offered wine, but usually in small, controlled amounts. A drunk fool might be funny, but also unpredictable, and unpredictability near a monarch was not always welcome. Did he earn a salary? In some cases, yes. Certain jesters were considered part of the royal household and received a modest stipend, enough to buy necessities but never enough to rise above their station. Others were granted clothing, food, and shelter instead of coin, making them entirely dependent on royal favor. There were a few exceptionally rare jesters who amassed small fortunes, usually through gifts from amused patrons or by cleverly investing what little they earned. But most lived frugally, their bells jingling more often than their purses. Clothing was both their signature and their shackle. The jester's costume was deliberately loud, bright colors, mismatched patterns, dangling bells. It marked them instantly even from afar. It separated them from courtiers and servants alike. To wear such garb was to be unmistakable and unmissable. This meant the jester could never truly disappear. Even off duty, he might be stopped, asked to perform, mocked, or used for amusement. His costume was not just a uniform. It was a cage of color. And while nobles changed fashions by the season, The jester's garb often remained the same for years, patched, faded, stitched at the elbows. Only those in favor received new outfits, and even then the materials were rarely fine. What about relationships, family, marriage? Here too, life was complicated. Most jesters did not marry. It was not strictly forbidden, but neither was it encouraged. Many courts preferred their jesters unattached. Easier to control, less likely to become entangled in alliances or divided in loyalty. A few did marry, often outside court life, taking spouses from nearby towns or among the lower ranks of servants. These unions were usually modest and required the court's permission. But love, true companionship, remained a rare luxury in the jester's world. Children of jesters sometimes followed in their parents' footsteps, particularly if they displayed early wit or talent. But the profession was not one people hoped to inherit. It was more often something endured. Were they respected? That depends on the eye of the beholder. Among the nobility, jesters were viewed with a curious mixture of affection, amusement, and mild disdain. They were tolerated, even beloved, but rarely honored. A good jester might be praised, a brilliant one might be protected, but respected in the same way as a knight or scholar? Seldom. Among servants, the jester's position inspired both envy and suspicion. He lived better than most, after all, in a warmer room, better food, direct access to the king. But he also walked a lonely line, neither friend nor master, neither trusted nor truly known. There was always the risk of being seen as other, not quite human, not quite belonging, a figure of fun, never of fraternity. And yet, the jester endured, because for all its discomforts, its daily indignities and unpredictability, the role offered something rare in medieval life: attention, to be seen, heard, remembered. He may not have dined with dukes or ruled a fiefdom, but he left his imprint on the air, in laughter, in rhyme, in whispers that survived long after the candles died out. And sometimes, when he passed in the corridor, a maid would smile at him, not out of duty, but warmth. Sometimes a knight would share a crust of bread, not as an order, but a gesture. These were small kindnesses, but to a jester, whose life was often a dance of pretense and pageantry, they were as golden as a king's coin. So tonight, as the jester lays on his straw mattress, belly half full with lentil stew and stale cheese, he does not dream of riches. He dreams of laughter, not loud or forced, but quiet and genuine. A laugh shared in a garden, a smirk from a friend, a chuckle from a child who doesn't yet understand that jesters are not meant to be loved. And in that dream, for once, the jester's bells are silent. There is a peculiar kind of silence that settles over a jester who has lost his audience. Not the silence of a paused joke or a held breath before a punchline. No, this is different. This silence arrives like fog, slowly, then all at once. It creeps into the great hall, settles on his stool, and wraps itself around the place where laughter used to live. It is the sound of a favor that has withered, and it is perhaps the most terrifying sound a jester can hear. In the medieval court, favor was a currency more volatile than gold. One day you are the sparkle in the king's eye, the man who lifts his spirit, breaks his gloom, makes him snort wine through his nose. The next, you are background noise, a forgotten melody, a relic of yesterday's humor. And there is no warning, no notice, just a change in the air. The first sign is often subtle. The king no longer looks for you when he enters. Your jokes, once met with uproar, now draw polite smirks or distracted glances. You are asked to perform less often. The steward stops nodding when you pass. The queen, who once giggled behind, her goblet now studies her fingernails when you speak. Then come the whispers. That fool's losing his edge. I miss the old stories. He mocked the wrong cousin, didn't he? And finally, one day you walk into the hall and no one asks you to perform, no one scolds you, but no one smiles either. You have become invisible. For a jester, invisibility is a kind of death. His entire existence is built upon being seen, being heard, being responded to. Without that, he has no purpose, no identity. Some try to reclaim attention, Louder jokes, riskier performances, desperate antics. A few succeed. They claw their way back into favor, often through sheer audacity, but many do not. Their boldness is seen as annoying, their energy as grating. And if they push too far, they offend, or embarrass, or remind the king too sharply that he is aging, or that his latest marriage is unhappy, or that his fool is no longer funny. And then, the fall becomes a plunge. What happens next depends on the court. In the kindest of scenarios, the jester is quietly retired, given a small allowance, sent to live in a nearby village or monastery. A few are allowed to stay at court, drifting, in the background, occasionally summoned for old time's sake, like a favorite book no longer read but still shelved with care. In harsher courts, the jester is dismissed without coin or comfort, turned out into the world with nothing but his motley, his bell-worn hat, and the fading memory of laughter. Some fall into wandering, becoming street performers, tavern jesters, or joining traveling troupes. But courtly wit does not always translate to public humor. What made a king laugh may leave peasants unmoved, and what once paid in pheasant and plum wine now pays in copper coins, if anything at all. Others are not so lucky. There are tales, whispered, not written, of jesters imprisoned for offending too deeply. One was said to have made a pun about the king's deceased brother during a funeral feast. The laughter that followed was his last. He disappeared by morning. Another, after falling from favor, was kept as a curiosity in a noble's estate, not to perform, but to be mocked himself. Forced to wear his old garb, made to relive his former role while others laughed at him, not with him. The cruelty lies not only in the punishment, but in the erasure. A jester, more than any other courtier, depends on presence. When he is no longer remembered, it is as if he never existed. His verses fade, his characters disappear, his jokes, once beloved, become attributed to others. Even his name, if he ever had one beyond the fool, is forgotten. There is a deep tragedy in this, because many jesters gave years, even decades, to their courts. They softened the king's angers, mended courtly spats, lifted spirits in plague and famine, helped young princes learn to laugh, and yet they leave with nothing. No lands, no heirs, no statue in the garden or name in the hall of portraits, just a silence where laughter used to live. But some do not fade quietly. There are rare stories, like that of Jan Polak, a jester of the Polish court, who, after dismissal, became a wandering balladeer. He retold the tales of courts he had served, not with bitterness, but with a sort of whimsical defiance. He sang of kings with potatoes for heads, of queens who whispered to mirrors, of jesters who turned into owls and flew away. People laughed. People listened, and so in taverns and markets his legend grew, even as the court that dismissed him forgot he'd ever lived. This too is a kind of victory, because in the end, what does a jester have? Not gold, not title, not power. He has only this, the memory he leaves behind, the echo of joy, the shadow of laughter, and that may be more enduring than any crown. So tonight, somewhere far from castle walls, a man in faded motley sits by a fire. His hat is patched, his lute is old, but when he plays, people still gather. They do not know his name, but they know his song, and that, perhaps, is enough. Long before the jester's footsteps echoed through stone corridors or his voice bounced off gilded banquet halls, he belonged to another world, a world far noisier, far dirtier, and far more free. The world of the road, of carnivals, fairs, festivals, and fireside performances. It is here, in the mud-caked fields and bustling village greens, that the jester's older cousin lives and thrives. The wandering fool, the carnival wit, the rustic comic with straw in his hair and blasphemy on his tongue. For many jesters, especially those dismissed, forgotten, or never chosen by royalty, this world is both sanctuary and stage. It is, in a sense, a return home. The traveling. Fool is not weighed down by courtly etiquette or royal moods. He need not measure every syllable to avoid a beheading. His audience is simpler, louder, and more honest. A village crowd does not pretend to laugh. It either howls with glee or throws turnips. The stakes are different. Not survival, but sustenance. Performs not for favor but for coin, or bread, or a place by the fire. He tells tales that the nobility would faint at, bawdy, irreverent, shameless. He sings of drunken abbots and lusty milkmaids. He acts out mock battles between sausage and cheese. He impersonates the local sheriff with alarming accuracy, and the people love him, not because he flatters them, but because he flatters no one. He mocks kings and popes with equal joy. In a world where so much is out of reach, the traveling, Fool offers one priceless gift, the right to laugh at those above. In many ways, this laughter is more powerful than any jester's rhyme behind palace doors. Because it belongs to the people, it is not borrowed from a monarch's favor. It is not constrained by etiquette or threat of imprisonment. It is raw, raucous, real. But this life, too, comes with its hardships. The roads are long. The weather is cruel. Performances are often outdoors, on makeshift stages, hay carts, or even tree stumps. The fool competes with livestock, gossip, and the ever-present distraction of ale. There are days when no one laughs, nights when no one offers shelter, weeks when his boots wear thin and his voice turns hoarse. He must carry everything he owns. His costume, patched and frayed, is both uniform and bedroll. His instruments, if he has them, are repaired with twine and hope. His companions, if any, are thieves, musicians, or other outcasts. But for all this, he is free. No curfew, no etiquette, no fear of saying the wrong thing to the wrong noble. He sings what he wishes, mocks whom he pleases. In the towns, children run after him. Old men nod knowingly at his jokes. Bakers toss him crusts. Brewers offer a sip in exchange for a song. And during festivals, those grand, chaotic, holy-turned profane events, the fool becomes a star. The Feast of Fools, in particular, is his moment. A topsy-turvy holiday where roles are reversed. Rules are broken and sacred things are openly mocked. Bishops dress as pigs. Priests sing songs backward. The ugliest man is crowned Lord of Misrule. And presiding over this madness? The fool. Not a servant now, but a master. He parades through town on a donkey, throwing cabbage at merchants and shouting riddles that make no sense until they suddenly do. He leads dances that end in mock duels, sermons that dissolve into drinking songs. He stands atop barrels and declares himself the true king, if only for a day. And the people cheer, because for one night, the world is turned upside down and dull. In that inversion lies a strange kind of truth. The fool is not foolish. He knows the peasants still toil, the taxes still climb, the Lord's son still struts like a goose in borrowed armor. But for a brief moment, everyone gets to laugh at the absurdity of it all, and that is powerful. Because in medieval life, joy is rare, laughter is rationed. Celebration comes at the price of survival. So when the fool brings mirth, he brings more than comedy. He brings medicine. And while he may not be paid in gold, he is repaid in memory. A joke that echoes in a barn months later. Story retold at a wedding feast. A catchphrase shouted across a field as two brothers bicker over pigs. These are his legacy. And sometimes when a former court jester finds himself among these rustic gatherings, he feels a strange sort of peace. His jokes no longer need polish, his rhymes can be rough, his performance can wobble, and still be welcomed. Here he is not a disappointment or a relic. He is simply the fool, and that, strangely, is enough. So tonight, in a field outside a muddy village, a man in a patchwork cloak dances with a jug on his head. Children giggle, farmers clap. A dog barks in rhythm. He sings a song about a knight who fell in love with his own reflection, and when he finishes, someone offers him stew. Another hands him a blanket. A third asks if he'll return next week. He smiles, genuinely. Because here, Outside the marble walls and velvet thrones, the fool has found something that no court could give him: a home. In a world governed by rigid roles and solemn masks, the jester alone was allowed, expected even, to be mad. He wore colors no one else dared wear. He said what others feared to whisper. He laughed at sacred things and danced during moments meant for mourning. He was, to all appearances, mad. But here's the question that echoes through the old stone corridors long after the laughter has faded. Was he really mad? Or was he the only one sane enough to survive? There's something strangely elegant in the way medieval society treated madness. It was feared, yes, sometimes punished, sometimes pitied. But occasionally, when cloaked in humor and charm, it was permitted, even welcomed. Because what better way to speak forbidden truths than through someone already dismissed as irrational? If a noble mocked the bishop, it might be blasphemy. But if a fool did it, oh, he's just mad. It's nothing. If a courtier questioned the king's decision, it might be treason. But if the jester said, "Your Majesty, even your horse thinks that's unwise," it might win applause. This allowed the fool a rare freedom. He could observe, question, poke, prod, all under the protection of perceived madness. But make no mistake, beneath the jester's jests often lay a mind as sharp as any scholar's. In fact, some historians argue that the best jesters were chosen not just for their wit, but for their profound emotional intelligence. They could read a room quicker than most courtiers. They understood psychology centuries before the word existed. They knew when to deflect, when to expose, when to soothe, and when to provoke. They used metaphor, riddle, and rhythm, not just for entertainment, but as tools of revelation. A jester might tell a story of a donkey dressed in silk, and everyone would laugh at the image. But a moment later, a subtle hush would fall, because everyone knew the donkey was the king's cousin. The silk, a new title he hadn't earned. The laughter had teeth, and still, the jester smiled. This ability to veil critique in humor required immense mental agility. It was not the wit of the tavern drunk or the loud gossip, but something more calculated, a balancing act of language and tone. In some cases, fools were genuinely studied men. There are accounts of jesters fluent in Latin, well-versed in scripture, able to debate monks and quote Aristotle, but always with a twist, a parody, a wink. Their intelligence was masked, their erudition wrapped in absurdity, because knowledge is power, and in the hands of a jester, it had to be disguised. Then there were those who were labeled natural fools, people with mental or developmental differences who, by their very nature, spoke bluntly, honestly, without filter. And yet, even among them, wisdom often surfaced. There's a story of a jester, simple in speech, prone to sudden songs, who was asked during a famine what should be done. While others debated grain policy and trade routes, he said, "Feed the hungry before they turn into wolves." It was a childlike response. And yet, no one argued, because it was true. More true, perhaps, than any treatise or council decree. There's something about fools, in literature, history, even folklore, that points toward this paradox. They appear least qualified to lead, and yet often deliver the clearest truths. In Shakespeare's plays, the fool is often wiser than the king. In folktales, the village idiot becomes the unlikely hero. In real medieval courts, jesters occasionally steered kings away from disaster, not by force, but by laughter. Is it possible, then, that the fool was never truly mad, or was he simply pretending to be, so the world would leave him free to speak? There's beauty in that idea, a kind of quiet rebellion, because madness, real or feigned, gave the jester cover, and cover gave him courage. He could insult a baron and claim it was the bells speaking. He could question a law and say, "Just a dream I had." Probably the cheese. He could name the elephant in the room and pretend he thought it was a horse, and everyone laughed. Because they wanted to, because deep down, they needed someone to say what they could not. So the jester became a vessel, not just of humor, but of collective truth. He carried the thoughts others buried. He aired the doubts others swallowed. He reflected gently and absurdly the world as it truly was, not as it pretended to be. That is not madness. That is wisdom in costume, and it came at a cost. The jester was often misunderstood, feared, mocked. He had few allies, fewer protections, and lived at the whim of powerful men. His intelligence had to be hidden beneath jest, his honesty masked by riddles, his insight deflected by absurdity, and yet he endured, not because he was mad, but because, perhaps, he was the only one willing to seem mad in order to remain sane. So tonight, as the stars scatter across the sky and the fire in the jester's chamber burns low, he takes a quill to parchment, not for a poem, not for a joke, but for a thought that came to him in a dream. When the world is upside down, only the fool walks upright. He smiles, folds the paper, and tucks it behind his lute. Tomorrow, he may sing it, or not. For now, he simply lets the quiet settle, a gentle kind of knowing, the kind that comes only to those mad enough to understand everything. In the hush that falls between midnight and dawn, when even the rats beneath the flagstones have settled, a strange thing stirs in the castle. Not footsteps, not whispers, but dreams. Dreams glide through the corridors, soft as mist, drifting past, suits of armor, over carved banisters, through the velvet drapes of noble chambers. They are strange, as dreams often are, filled with upside-down feasts and talking wolves, staircases that lead into the sky, and rivers that flow with wine. And somewhere, almost always, the jester appears. In the minds of kings and queens, dukes and bishops his figure wanders, cap jingling softly, eyes wide and knowing, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. He arrives uninvited, says nothing, and simply exists. Why? Because jesters were not just performers of the waking world. They were symbols, symbols of conscience, of chaos, of buried truths, and symbols, once embedded in memory, make their way into dreams with startling ease. The king who laughed at the fool's mockery that morning may find himself in a dream that night, standing naked before a crowd while the jester tosses riddles into the wind. The queen who scoffed at a rhyme might see the jester in her sleep, holding a mirror to her face, though her reflection does not show. The general, prideful and stern, might hear the jester's voice echo from the trees as he dreams of a battle he thought forgotten. It is not magic, it is memory. Because jesters, for all their ridiculousness, lodge themselves deep in the minds of those they perform for, not just because they're amusing, but because they dare to say what others won't. And the mind, especially in sleep, cannot help but revisit those forbidden truths. Some rulers feared this. There were kings who refused to let their jesters perform near bedtime. One French nobleman even ordered his fool to stay silent after vespers, claiming, "The laughter clings to me in sleep and makes me doubt the sun." Others embraced it. One queen was said to call for her jester when nightmares plagued her. He would not soothe her with lullabies, but with absurd tales, stories so illogical, so dreamlike, that they gently dissolved the horror of her own imaginings. "Bishop," he once said to her, dreamt he'd turned into a chicken and spent the rest of the night pecking at the psalms. She laughed. The nightmare faded. It's an odd skill, isn't it? To reach someone not just with words, but with the kind of impression that lingers into sleep. To be remembered not for grandeur or violence or seduction, but for absurdity. Yet that absurdity often revealed more than any sermon, because in dreams the mind is honest. Walls fall, titles vanish, and what remains are emotions, unresolved, thoughts, fears in disguise. And who better to guide someone through such terrain than the fool? The jester in dreams is not always playful. Sometimes he is cryptic, silent, watching. He may appear in the background, smiling faintly while a king runs through an endless corridor. He may be the one who hands the knight a map with no words, then disappears. He may be the voice in the wind that says, Careful what you crown, it may not be yours. These fragments, strange and poetic, are not just dreams. They are echoes. Echoes of the jester's daytime performances, twisted through the logic of sleep. Because even when no one is watching, the jester leaves a mark. Not in ink, not in stone, but in the private theater behind the eyes. That place where power has no defense, and truth walks freely. And sometimes, he visits the dreams of those below. The cook dreams of a feast where the pigs serve the nobles. The maid dreams of a dancing broom that speaks in rhyme. The stable boy dreams of a jester on a dragon juggling fire and advice. These dreams, silly and shimmering, offer relief from labor. They stretch the mind. They remind even the lowliest of folk that laughter belongs to them too, that they are not forgotten even if only in sleep. And what of the jester's own dreams? Do fools dream? And if they do, what do they see? Do they dream of applause? Of softer beds? Of being mistaken for a duke just once and not corrected, or do they dream of silence? Of taking off the cap, walking into the woods and never being asked to make another person laugh again? Maybe, or maybe they don't dream at all. Maybe for them, dreams are what happened during the day, when they watch a king smile for the first time in a week, when they hear a child repeat their riddle at supper, when they perform a tale so ridiculous that even the saddest face in court twitches with joy. Maybe for a fool, the waking world is already so strange. There's nothing left to dream. And so, as the night deepens and sleep wraps its arms around every soul in the castle, the jester lies in his little bed. He breathes quietly. His cap hangs on the hook. His bells are still. And somewhere, in the dreaming minds of many, wherein he jests again, not with noise, but with presence, the kind that lingers long after the show ends. There are moments in history when even laughter must kneel. Times when the great halls grow quiet, not from boredom or etiquette, but from fear. When the market's empty, and the bells that once rang for feasts toll only for funerals. When the air smells not of roasting meats or flowered oils, but of smoke, sweat, and something darker. Sickness. In medieval Europe, illness was never far away. It lived in the water, the wind, the rats beneath the floorboards. A cough could become a death sentence, a rash a revelation of doom, and no sickness was more feared than the plague. The Black Death, that grim veil which swept across the continent, did not spare palaces. Kings died, queens withered, bishops fell silent, servants vanished, entire towns dissolved into whispers, and, in this darkness, in this wide silence, the jester remained. What does a fool do when the world stops laughing? He stays. He keeps his bells on. He tells jokes no one dares repeat. He mocks death to its face, and not out of ignorance but defiance, because someone must. In some courts, jesters were dismissed during times of plague. Too frivolous, they said. Too dangerous to keep. They were sent away, told to return when the air was cleaner, the halls more cheerful. But others were kept closer. Because in the face of death, there is nothing more valuable than one who can make you forget, even for a moment, that you are afraid. The jester sings of skeletons who dance through the kitchens, stealing the pies. He tells tales of plague fleas who fall in love and flee to the mountains. He mimes a coughing fit so dramatic that the steward drops his spoon, and the court laughs, not because it's truly funny, but because it's needed. Laughter becomes a kind of shield, a ritual, a spell against the darkness. And the jester? He becomes both priest and clown, officiating at the altar of absurdity while the world trembles. But it isn't easy, for the jester is not immune. He too watches friends grow pale and vanish. He sees the child he once juggled for buried in a pit. He hears the queens weeping through the stone walls at night, and still he jests. Because the performance must go on, not because of vanity, but because the moment the jokes stop, the fear will win. There is bravery in this, not the kind sung in ballads, No swords or dragons, but a quieter, deeper courage. To laugh while grieving, to dance while ill, to sing when the lungs burn and the stomach turns. Some jesters, in their final moments, reportedly joked about death itself. One is said to have requested, "Bury me with my bells. That way the worms will know they're feasting on royalty." Another, delirious with fever, asked his nurse if the next world had better wine, or at least kinder kings. These final jests are not merely gallows humor. They are acts of resistance, a refusal to let sorrow have the last word. There are records of jesters aiding plague doctors, not medically, but emotionally. They'd distract the sick while treatments were applied. They'd keep children calm in overcrowded hospitals. They'd escort the dead with songs, not sermons. In some towns, when all other forms of order collapsed, the fool remained the last voice of reason, dressed in motley, singing into the smoke. But even outside plague years, sickness was constant. Cold could become pneumonia, a broken toe, a rotting leg. There were no antibiotics, no proper surgery, no real understanding of infection. Pain was a companion, and death a guest who rarely knocked before entering. And yet the jester made room for him. He spoke of death not with reverence, but with sarcasm. He gave it names: Sir Bonecloak, the Pale Butler, Queen Silence. He impersonated death in skits. He gave it bad posture, a squeaky voice, a love of terrible puns. By mocking death, he made it manageable. By laughing at it, he made it smaller. And in doing so, he helped others carry their own grief. Because in the end, that is what jesters were best at. They carried emotions for others. They turned terror into theater. They turned weeping into wit. And sometimes when the hall was empty and the air too thick to breathe, they cried alone, so others wouldn't have to. There's a story, likely apocryphal, of a jester who continued to perform for the king even as the court died around them. Each day fewer nobles appeared. Each night fewer servants returned. But the jester kept coming. On the last night he arrived to find the hall dark and cold. Only the king remained, gaunt and gray, slumped on his throne. The jester bowed. He said, "Shall I jest for the ghosts, your majesty?" The king, with a whisper of a smile, replied, "Only if they still have ears." And so he performed, to the shadows, to memory, to death itself. Because laughter, in the end, is not the opposite of sorrow. It is its companion, its twin, its torch in the dark. And no, one knew that better than the fool. They say laughter is light, that it lifts the mood, clears the air, makes heavy things momentarily bearable. But in the medieval court, laughter could be a weapon, sharp as steel, precise as poison. And the one who wielded it? The fool. He stood, on the margins of politics, neither noble nor peasant, not quite subject nor servant. But his words traveled, faster than letters, deeper than proclamations. A clever rhyme could reach from castle to tavern before the sun set. A biting impersonation, performed once in a noble hall, might echo for years in the corridors of power. In that sense, the jester was not just a clown. He was a mouthpiece, a messenger, sometimes unknowingly, a spark. Picture a jester standing before the king and his council. The air is thick with tension. A neighboring lord has raised taxes. A rebellion brews. Diplomats from another court have just arrived, their robes still dusty from the road. And what does the jester say? He says, our honored guests, I trust the weight of their jewels hasn't sunk the boat that brought them." The room laughs. But beneath the laugh is a message. You wear your wealth too proudly. Or he says, "My lord, if the rebels were half as hungry as your taxmen, they'd have eaten the treasury by now." Again, laughter, but also discomfort, because now the fool has spoken aloud what the court has only whispered, and once said, a thing cannot be unsaid. That is the dangerous magic of jest. It cloaks criticism in charm. It coats truth in honey, and in doing so it spreads, unchecked, unstoppable. Some kings understood this. They used it. They would plant jokes in their fool's routine, opinions too controversial to speak directly. If the room laughed, the king had his answer. If it didn't, he could shrug. Oh, just a fool's joke. It was a form of political testing, a human barometer, a way to probe sentiment without drawing a blade. But other kings feared it. They saw that the fool could shape perception faster than a bishop's sermon or a knight's campaign, that one clever turn of phrase could do more damage to a noble's reputation than any formal accusation. There were jesters who mocked foreign ambassadors, not cruelly, but cunningly. They played up accents, mimicked rituals, questioned motives, in the form of riddles. Why does a duke bring 7 gifts if one would suffice, to show his purse is wide or his cause is weak? Such lines were meant to amuse but also to provoke, and provoke they did. There are tales, some documented, others whispered, of jests sparking diplomatic incidents. One fool, in the court of a German margrave, made a joke about a visiting envoy's limp. The envoy took offense. His master in turn saw it as an insult to his entire house. A treaty, months in the making, unraveled overnight. The fool, banished. Not for the joke itself, but for revealing a truth that had consequences. Another, jester in a southern court, compared a king's new alliance to a wedding where the bride forgets the groom's name. The metaphor spread. It became a saying among merchants, then among scribes. Eventually, it reached the allied court, where it was taken as a slur. The alliance faltered, all from one line, wrapped in laughter. This was the tightrope the jester walked, to entertain without igniting, to criticize without condemning, to speak truth to power, without toppling it. Sometimes he succeeded, sometimes he slipped, and when he fell, the consequences were rarely his alone. Because in court, perception is power, and perception, once altered, cannot be put back in its box. A noble mocked by the jester becomes less feared, a bishop parodied in song becomes less holy, a monarch laughed at too often becomes vulnerable. This is why jesters were both valued and watched. Their jokes were monitored, their performances discussed behind closed doors. What did he mean by that line about the falcon? Was that verse about the harvest? Or the general's wife? Has he been speaking to the cooks again? They're full of dangerous talk. Even when the jester meant no harm, and most didn't, his words lived beyond him. They were repeated, embellished, carried into rooms he would never enter, and in that way, he became a political actor, unwitting perhaps, but potent. Of course, some fools embraced this role. They used their platform not just to mock, but to influence. They would insert subtle messages into their stories, encouragements for mercy, veiled critiques of corruption, sly praises of unseen heroes. They saw themselves not just as mirrors, but as nudgers, shifting the course of power one laugh at a time. Others, wiser perhaps, played dumb. They claimed innocence. What? Me? I meant no harm. Just a rhyme about a goose in a barrel. But they knew. They always knew. Because words, once loosed, take on lives of their own. And laughter, though soft in sound, can echo loudly in history. So tonight, as the jester prepares, for his next performance, he reviews his lines carefully. He changes a name, he swaps a metaphor. He softens one verse, sharpens another. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. Because in a world where kingdoms rise and fall on whispers, a fool's joke is never just a joke, it is a torch. And where it is thrown or dropped can set fire to thrones. It is easy to imagine the jester always surrounded by courtiers laughing, children clapping, kings smiling, lords scoffing. He is, after all, a public figure. His work is never done alone. His stage is always crowded. And yet, he is often the loneliest man in the room, because being surrounded is not the same as being seen. To be a jester is to wear a mask not just in performance, but in life. To filter every thought, every fear, every ounce of honesty through the sieve of humor. And in such a life, true friendship is both rare and priceless. Still, Sometimes and it blooms. Not loudly, not in fanfare or feasts, but quietly, in gestures, in shared glances, in a crust of bread left on a doorstep still warm. Some of these friends are servants, the laundress who patches his motley without being asked, the cook's boy who sneaks him leftover sweets and calls him sir, even when no one's watching, the stable hand who sharpens his juggling knives while pretending not to know whose they are. These friendships are forged not in words, but in rhythm, the daily passing of silent kindnesses. A nod in the corridor, a candle left burning, a name remembered when others forget. Then there are the scribes, quiet men and women hunched over scrolls, ignored by the powerful, overlooked by the proud, but watched always by the fool. For they are observers too. They record what he performs, sometimes scribbling in the margins. The fool jested of rain falling indoors, a joke perhaps about leaks in the roof, or something more. Sometimes a jester and a scribe become unlikely confidants. Over shared ink pots and scribbled rhymes they find common language. One speaks in jokes, the other in lines. Both translate truth for those who cannot read it, directly. And sometimes, rarely, wonderfully, a jester befriends another fool. This is a special kind of bond. Two jesters meeting at a royal wedding or festival might at first spar, trading insults, each trying to win the crowd. But in the quiet after the performance, they speak of deeper things. What makes them laugh when they are alone? What dreams they had before they wore bells? What lines they dare not speak, even in jest? These moments are gold, not because they are dramatic, but because they are real. There are no masks here, no rhymes, no posturing, just two souls in motley, leaning against a wall, sharing dried figs and silence. And then, there are the companions who don't speak at all. The animals. Many jesters kept pets, not just as props, but as partners. A dog, trained to sit solemnly during jokes and bark only at the bishop's name. A crow, taught to mimic noble phrases, in a noble's voice. A goat, bedecked in a miniature crown, paraded through town as King George the Hairy. These creatures were more than comic devices. They were confidants. They listened without judgment. They stayed when others left. They didn't laugh, but they didn't expect laughter either. There's something deeply soothing about talking to a dog when no one else will listen, or teaching a pig to bow just because it makes you smile, or sharing your only piece of cheese with a cat who purrs on your windowsill. In a world that demanded performance, animals offered presence, and presence for a jester is everything. Some fools were even buried with their companions, a small gravestone beside a larger one, marked with a bell or paw print. Their names lost perhaps, but their bond etched into the earth. Because friendship, in the life of a fool, is not measured by ceremony. It is measured by stillness, by who stays when. The laughter ends by who knows the jester not as a character, but as a man. And once in a while, rarely, wondrously, a jester befriends someone noble, not out of strategy, not for favor, but because against all odds, two very different lives align. Perhaps it's a princess who sees through the performance, who notices when the fool flinches at certain jokes. Perhaps it's an old knight, retired and half-deaf, who laughs not at the jokes but at the way the jester juggles apples like he's dancing with ghosts. These friendships are secret, precious things. They don't last forever. Nothing in court does, but they leave marks, not on the skin, but on the spirit. The jester carries them quietly, in the way he softens a punchline, in the pause before he insults a stranger, in the smile that holds a little more sorrow than usual. Because friendship, for a fool, is never assumed. It is always a gift, and he knows its value. So tonight, as the castle sleeps and the jester returns to his little room, he finds a crust of bread on the sill. Fresh, still warm. Beside it, a feather, black and glossy. He doesn't smile broadly. He just exhales, sits down, and eats in silence. And in that moment, he is not a fool. He is simply not alone. In the grand halls of the medieval world, Among velvet drapes and wax-polished floors, there was one mirror no one could polish, no servant could dust, no craftsman could shape. It did not hang on walls. It jingled when it moved. It bowed when mocked. It danced when asked nothing of it. This mirror was the fool. He reflected everyone who looked at him, not with perfect symmetry, but in a way far more revealing, distorted, exaggerated, honest. For that is what jesters did in truth. They were not just entertainers. They were the crooked mirrors of their time, not mirrors that flattered, mirrors that told the awkward truth. When a baron strutted with too much pride, the jester imitated his walk with a goose feather in his hat. The court roared. The baron smiled stiffly, but later that night, he walked a little less wide. When the bishop scolded a servant for spilled wine, the jester spilled his own cup and declared, "Ah, the wine seeks blessing." The servant giggled. The bishop flushed, but he never scolded as loudly again. The jester showed people not who they thought they were, but what they acted like, and often that made all the difference. In this way, he became a kind of teacher, a teacher without a classroom, without books, without sermons or scrolls. His lessons were jokes, his chalkboard, the air, his syllabus, human folly, and the court, whether they admitted it or not, learned from him. He reminded them that their titles could not protect them from looking ridiculous, that their wealth did not hide their vanity, that their power could make them feared, yes, but never funny, and people, when shown their flaws in jest, sometimes softened. Not always, but often enough, because there is something disarming about laughter. It breaks down pride more gently than shame. It opens the door to reflection without demanding it. The fool's genius was knowing that people could hear truth better when it was dressed in bells, and perhaps that is why so many kings kept fools near, not just for diversion, but for self-awareness. When the court grew too solemn, the fool made them laugh. When it grew too arrogant, he made them blush. When it forgot its own absurdities, he reminded them, kindly, but clearly. There's a reason the fool could say what the minister could not. He had no agenda, no ambition, no army. Just a tongue that knew how to twist words until they slipped past defenses, and once past, they did their quiet work. Even outside the court, among peasants and travelers, the fool remained a mirror. He exaggerated village disputes into absurd epics. He turned gossip into fables. He took pride and wrapped it in ribbon until it looked as silly as it truly was. People laughed, of course, but they also learned. Because when we see ourselves reflected in laughter, something shifts. We loosen, we listen, we change. And yet the mirror cuts both ways. The jester, in reflecting others, also saw himself. Constantly. He saw what made people uncomfortable, what made them cruel, what made them lie, not to others, but to themselves. And sometimes late at night he would sit and wonder, am I showing them their flaws, or simply distracting them from them? Do they laugh because they recognize the truth, or because they don't want to? And what do I see when I hold the mirror to my own face? It was a lonely kind of wisdom, to see so clearly, to show so carefully, and to never be sure if it made a difference. But the fool kept doing it, because someone had to. Someone had to remind the proud that they, too, trip on their shoelaces, that even queens have spinach in their teeth, that even kings are human, and that humanity is often hilarious. There's a strange dignity in that role, not grand, not royal, but necessary, because every society needs someone to laugh at it, to humble it, to remind it that seriousness is not the same as wisdom, and that joy sometimes sees clearer than judgment. So tonight, as the candles flicker and the stars slip behind clouds, the jester takes off his hat and looks into a bowl of water. The surface trembles slightly. His reflection stares back, tilted, imperfect, almost comical. He grins, not sadly, not smugly, just knowingly, because the face in the water is his, and also everyone's. And in that, somehow, he finds peace. It hangs on the wall each night like a moth at rest. 3 soft points, each drooping in its own weary curve. Bells at the ends, small and silent for now. The colors, once brilliant, have dulled with time. Faded crimson, tired gold, frayed green, the jester's hat, the motley cap with its 3 horns. To some, it is just costume, a comic exaggeration, something to laugh at before a feast. But to the jester, it is far more. It is both a badge and a burden, both a signal and a silence. It is the crown he was given, instead of the one he might have worn. No one knows for certain why the jester's hat has 3 points. Some say it mimics the ass's, ears and tail, an insult transformed into a uniform. Others believe it represents the Holy Trinity, mocked and mirrored. Still others whisper it echoes the triple path of a fool's fate, laughter, danger, and loneliness. But ask a jester, a real one, not the drunken imitators, and he'll tell you, each point of the hat holds something he cannot say aloud. First, the truth he is allowed to speak. The jester, unlike others, may voice what the court dares not. He can name the rot beneath the perfume. He can point to the emperor's bare skin and call it fashion. His cap gives him license, but only within the dance of jest. It is a sharp kind of truth, dressed in whimsy, spoken in song, and yet, still truth. The second point? The lies he must live, because not every laugh is real. Not every story is harmless. The jester must lie sometimes to protect himself, to flatter, to soothe, to survive. He lies when he says the king's poem is brilliant, when he pretends not to see the tears in the steward's eyes, when he laughs louder than he feels. This too is part of the costume. And the third, the dreams he will never fulfill. Dreams he folds away like old parchment, the longing for a quiet life, perhaps, or to be loved without jest, or to speak plainly, once, just once, and be heard not as a fool but as a man. These dreams hang from the final horn of the hat, swaying softly each time he walks. That's why the bells are there, not just to draw attention, but to remind him of what he is, of what he carries, and of how close laughter and longing truly are. The hat is heavy, though it weighs little, not in thread but in meaning. Each morning as he puts it on, the jester does so with quiet ceremony. He straightens the tips, checks the stitching, adjusts the tilt. It is not vanity, it is preparation. A knight polishes his armor, a monk ties his robes, the jester dons his horns, and becomes who the world needs him to be. Because when he wears the hat, he becomes a mirror, a melody, a myth. But when he takes it off, he becomes a question, and questions are far more dangerous than jokes. There are moments, rare and private, when he looks at his hat and wonders what life might have been like without it, if he had not been born with a crooked smile, if he had not been noticed by a noble with a fondness for jest, if he had been a scribe or a sailor or simply left alone. Would he be happier? He doesn't know. He only knows that the hat has shaped him, as surely as the crown shapes a king. And though one jingles and the other gleams, both are symbols of surrender. Both come with duties. Both demand sacrifice. There are jesters who have died clutching their caps, who ask to be buried with the bells still tied, who knew that, for better or worse, the hat was the most honest thing they ever wore, and so it is treated with reverence. Not by all, but by him, because he knows that when he walks into the great hall, it is the hat they see first, the hat that allows him to say the unsayable, to mock the unmockable, to exist in a space between threat and delight. He wears it not because he is foolish, but because he is brave, because it takes courage to make others laugh when you are crumbling inside, because it takes strength to wear your sorrow like silk and call it comedy, because it takes faith in the absurd, in the broken, in the human, to put on bells and walk into a room full of swords. So tonight, as the jester places his hat on the hook, he does so gently, He touches each horn, listens to the faint chime, and smiles, not out of joy but recognition. This, he thinks, is my crown, not of power, not of praise, but of presence. And that, for now, is enough. The castle has no clocks. Not in the way we know them. No ticking, no glass, no minute hands inching their way around a numbered circle. Time here is kept by bells and light, by sun on stone and shadows stretching. The hour of prayer, the call to supper, the silence after curfew. Time is felt, not read. It is tasted in the soup's warmth, smelled in the fire's smoke, heard in the rhythm of footsteps in the corridor. And for the jester, time is something altogether stranger. It does not move forward. It loops. It plays. It hides in punchlines and lingers in silences. It slips between laughter and memory, like a coin down the cracks of a wooden floor. Ask a noble what year it is, and they'll name a reign, the 6th year of His Majesty's rule. Ask a clerk and he'll consult a ledger. Ask the jester. He'll pause, then say, "It is the day after the Duke tripped over his own dignity." And laugh. Because for the fool, time is not measured in reigns or wars or treaties. It is measured in moments, in glances, in the exact second when a joke lands or fails, in the breath held before a rhyme, in the beat that follows a roar of laughter, where for just a blink, the world feels whole. These are his hours. These are his markers. And they are precious because the jester knows better than anyone how quickly a moment fades. One day the court adores him. The next it forgets. One week the king calls for him nightly. The next a new singer has caught his favor. The jester's career is not built in years. It is built in instants. Little bursts of joy strung like pearls along the thread of fading memory. And yet he remembers everything, not by date, not by name, but by feeling. He remembers the day the queen wept behind her fan, not because she mourned, but because the pie reminded her of her mother. He remembers the laugh of a child who died that winter. He remembers the night the stars flickered like laughter held too long. To the jester, time is elastic. It stretches when he waits to perform. It compresses when the room erupts. It loops when he tells a story he's told 100 times and still it feels new. Sometimes it even reverses. When he walks into a room and sees a noble's son sitting where the father once sat, mimicking his gestures, echoing his voice, he is transported back to when he first arrived, to when he was younger, faster, more reckless. He wonders then how much of him still belongs to the now, and how much to the before. Because jesters do not age like other men. Their bodies tire, yes. Their knees ache. Their voices roughen. But their work is eternal. There is always a need for mirth. Always an appetite for truth hidden in nonsense. Always a space in the great hall that belongs to the one in motley. And so the jester does not count birthdays. He counts performances, not how old he is, but how often he has made someone forget the weight of time. That to him is the true calendar, the true clock. And yet time leaves its marks. On his costume, worn thin in the elbows. On his hat, now patched with fabric that doesn't quite match. On his eyes where the sparkle is slower but no less sincere. He sees new jesters now, younger, louder, braver. He watches them perform the same old tricks with new accents. He smiles. He applauds. He nods and he wonders how long before his last joke. Not out of sorrow, but out of readiness. Because even the jester knows. Every act has a final bow. Every rhyme has a last word. Every mirror, even the crooked one, must go still. And yet, as long as he stands, as long as he can lift a story, flick a pun, catch an eye, and he continues. Because time for the fool is not just what passes, it's what is given, and he gives generously. Tonight, as the sky deepens and the air grows cool, the jester steps outside. The courtyard is empty. The moon is thin and high. He breathes. No bells ring, no torches flare, just silence. And in that silence, he whispers a line he once wrote long ago but never performed. The clock without hands still ticks, in hearts and heels and hushes. He nods to the air, to the stars, to no one, and walks back inside, his feet light, his pace slow, because time tonight belongs to him, and he wears it like a second skin. The castle is quiet now. The music has stopped long ago. The minstrels have packed their instruments. The torches that once lined the corridors have turned to blackened stubs. Even the great hearth in the banquet hall, where flames once danced, high enough to kiss the rafters, has surrendered to ashes. No banners flutter, no footsteps echo. Only dust floats in slow spirals, lit faintly by the last golden light of late afternoon. And yet, something lingers, something softer than a whisper, warmer than memory, something that makes the air hum gently as if it remembers what it used to hold. Laughter, fleeting, faint, not real, not quite, and yet, somehow, still there, because laughter, when genuine, does not vanish. It embeds itself in walls. It seeps into wood. It settles like spice into the fabric of time, invisible and undeniable. And for those who once laughed here, there is a name, even if they do not recall it. Not the name in the royal ledgers. Not the full christened title or the signature at the bottom of formal documents. Just this, the fool, the jester, the laughing man with the little bells. He was never a man of history, not in the usual way. His stories were not scribed by monks. His deeds were not painted onto the domes of chapels. He never rode into battle, never claimed land, never left a bloodline to inherit his place. And yet, he left something smaller, and perhaps something greater. He left moments that hung in the air like light through stained glass, moments that passed from mouth to mouth, year to year, like songs whose authors have been forgotten but never their tune. The legacy of a jester is not written in stone. It is felt in smiles that rise without command. It is seen in a child imitating a funny dance passed down from a grandparent who once saw it in a court or a fair or a dream. It is heard in rhymes so old no one remembers their origin, yet still repeated before sleep, at supper, in games. 3 ducks walked into a chapel. A knight once wet a broomstick. Why did the bishop sneeze 5 times in May? Nobody knows where these started, but somewhere, somehow, a jester began them. And he is still there, in the giggles, in the timing and the quiet absurdity that makes a hard day softer. His presence remains in other ways too. In gestures, a wink paired with a pun, a bow that dips too low to be sincere. A shrug with both hands as if to say, "What do I know, I'm just the fool." There are scholars who study ancient plays and find characters strikingly familiar. Masked, motley, mischievous. Their names vary: Harlequin, Scaramouche, Pulcinella. Their origins blur across regions, but all of them echo the same figure: a fool, a truth-teller, a laughter-bringer. And in this lineage, every jester lives again, even the nameless ones, even those who died unmarked, unburied, unremembered by their lords. They return, not in statues or songs of glory, but in the tilt of a puppet's head, in the final line of a joke, in the sudden silence before the whole room erupts. The legacy of the jester is not glory, it is permission. Permission to laugh. Permission to question. Permission to feel light when the world is heavy. That is no small thing. And those who give such permission, even once, rarely vanish entirely. There are cobblers who remember a jester's advice about how to sell shoes by singing. There are bakers who, as children, were told to eat pie with the nose first by a man with bells on his knees. There are old knights who still tell stories about the fool who dared to challenge the king to a duel with feathers. The details change, but the feeling remains. That's what legacies truly are in the end. Not facts, not plaques, but feelings that stick long after the storyteller is gone. And perhaps this is why jesters never truly fear being forgotten. They know they won't be remembered by name, but by effect, by the echo they leave, by the ember they light, by the way someone years later leans back in a chair, sighs, and says, "I don't know why that made me laugh, it just did." That just is the jester's masterpiece. So tonight, long after the candles have burned out and the castle has surrendered to time, imagine this. A traveler stumbles upon the ruins. He finds a stone bench half buried in moss. He sits. The wind picks up, rustling through the dry leaves. He looks around, at the crumbled walls, the toppled columns. He smiles. Not because he remembers. Not because he knows, but because the place feels like something used to be joyful here. And that too is legacy, unseen, uncertain, unshakable. A warmth that outlives the fire, a sound that survives the silence, an echo that knows no end. And somewhere, just beyond the veil of memory and wind, the jester bows again, not to be seen, not to be praised, but simply because that was always the ending to his best stories. A bow, and then a smile. No one remembers the day he left. There was no farewell performance, no weeping crowd, no dramatic toss of the hat into the wind. One day he was there, jingling down the corridor, singing to the cat, offering advice to a turnip. And the next, he simply wasn't. The cook thought he'd gone to fetch firewood. The steward assumed he'd fallen asleep in the bell tower again. The queen, curious, asked after him softly during her embroidery. But by then, it was already too late. His chamber was empty. His hat still hung on the hook, the three horns drooping like tired questions. His lute, unstrung, rested quietly by the fire. And beside his bed, a note, not written in ink, but folded in silence. They never found his body. They never called a search party. Perhaps no one dared to admit he was truly gone. Perhaps it was easier to pretend he'd just wandered off, chasing a bird that told bad jokes or following a beetle with shiny shoes. And yet, soon the stories began, not all at once. Not loudly, but here and there, in whispers. At first, they were simple. A guard claimed he'd seen the jester dancing in the forest during a full moon, with no music playing. A child swore she'd heard, his laughter echoing from an old well. A monk at a distant monastery reported a motley-clad man had traded him a poem in exchange for an onion. Each tale was odd, unprovable, dreamlike. But none were laughed off, because deep down, everyone wanted to believe them, not because they needed answers, but because they missed him, and nothing makes a ghost more real than longing. So the stories grew. He was said to have joined a caravan of traveling performers, wandering from village to village, bringing laughter to those who had forgotten how. Others claimed he had become a hermit, not in a cave or a hut, but in people's dreams, appearing only when they were at their loneliest, whispering something so ridiculous they awoke smiling through tears. Some said he'd turned into a bird and a magpie with 3 feathers sticking straight up. Others believed he'd become a tune, one only children could hum, and only when they were upside down. There were even rumors of a village where no one cried, because the fool had passed through once and left behind a curse of endless, inconvenient giggles. None of these stories were confirmed, but none were denied, because that's what stories do, especially about those who brought joy. They bloom in the cracks left by absence, and the jester, more than anyone, had lived in those very cracks. People began to repeat his lines, not always correctly, but with heart. Never trust a goat in royal robes. A pie shared is a crown missed. Even death dances if the fiddler is bold enough. These sayings appeared on tavern walls, in wedding toasts, in lullabies whispered beside cradles. Sometimes no one remembered they came from him. But the feeling remained, and perhaps that was enough. Over time, the stories shifted. He became less man, more myth. Children believed he lived in the attic of every inn. leaving jokes written in flour on the tabletops. Farmers claimed their cows gave sweeter milk if you recited a jester's rhyme before sunrise. A bishop once declared that laughter itself was the final echo of God and his fool. Some even said he never truly existed, that he was a symbol, created by the lonely, the weary, the quietly hopeful. But those who had known him once, the queen, now gray-haired, the cook, half-deaf, the steward, long retired, they said nothing. They just smiled, because they remembered, not the stories, but the feeling, the warmth he left in the room, the way a tense moment unraveled at the sound of his step, the sudden peace that came after, a really truly foolish joke. That was the real legacy. Not the tales, but the pause after them, that gentle, heart-deep breath where one realizes, yes, the world is strange and sad and silly, and still somehow beautiful. So tonight, if you're walking alone and you hear something soft, not quite a laugh, not quite a song, look up. If the stars shimmer slightly, if the wind nudges you to smile, if your feet feel lighter for no reason at all, it might be nothing. But then again, it might be him, still dancing, still jesting, still reminding us that joy, like stories, never truly leaves. It simply finds new mouths, new halls, new hearts. And so, the fool lives on, not behind us, but beside us. Wherever a joke is needed, wherever a silence grows too heavy, wherever someone dares to believe that even a little nonsense can make sense of the world. So here we are. The curtain has fallen, though there was never really a stage. The music has faded, though you may still hear a distant hum, like laughter remembered, or a tune half sung in your dreams. The story of the jester, if there ever was just one, has been told, not linearly, not neatly, but the way all true stories unfold, in pieces, in echoes, in the quiet recognition of something already known. You've walked with him now, through crowded halls and cold corridors, through mockery and mischief, through loss, longing, joy, and jest. And perhaps somewhere along the way you recognized a piece of yourself. Because the truth is, the fool was never just one man. He was a voice inside many, the part that sees clearly when others pretend, the part that dares to say the ridiculous thing that is somehow also the truest, the part that carries pain not with bitterness but with laughter, the part that knows, deeply, quietly, that everything matters and nothing matters both at once. In this way, the jester has never truly vanished. He's in your stories. He's in your pauses. He's in the moment you trip on your own feet, then laugh instead of curse. He's in the gentle eye roll you give the world when it takes itself too seriously. He's in the way you soften someone's bad day with one well-timed smile. This isn't fantasy. This is legacy, not passed down in blood, but in breath, not worn as a crown, but carried as a lightness in the bones. And perhaps that's the whole point, that we all, at times, must become the fool, not to mock, not to escape, but to remind those around us that perfection is dull, that sincerity wears better with wrinkles, that wisdom sometimes wears bells, and that laughter, real, deep, unfaked laughter, is one of the rarest forms of freedom. So tonight, as you lay down, let the story rest beside you. Let it curl into the folds of your blanket, the softness of your pillow, the quiet behind your eyes. Breathe. You are not being asked to remember every tale, every rhyme, every line, just the feeling, just that little lightness in your chest, that small exhale that says, yes, I needed this. You have carried heavy things today, worries, regrets, lists, loops of thought that spin too quickly. Let the fool carry some of them now. Let him juggle your doubts and drop them on purpose. Let him tie a ribbon around your fear and call it fashion. Let him bow to your sorrow and say, good evening, my old friend. Shall we dance instead? He'll keep watch for a while. That's what he always did best. Not entertain, not distract, but accompany quietly, kindly, until the world felt a little less sharp, a little more possible. And so, dear listener, close your eyes. Feel the last gentle tremble of bells on the edge of silence. They do not ask for applause, only for rest. Let the halls of memory dim. Let the great door close. Let the final bow be taken, not by him, but by you. For you too have endured. You too have performed. For others, for yourself, for the world. And now, it is enough. You have laughed, you have listened, you have wandered through the candlelit corridors of a jester's life and found there not just oddity, but truth. And in truth, peace. So sleep now, and if you dream, may it be of motley cloaks, swirling in wind and soft songs sung in empty halls, and a smiling man with kind eyes who says, "Don't worry, I'll be here when you wake. The world is mad, yes, but it's also marvelous. And we, you and I, are just foolish enough to live it well. Good night, and thank you for letting the fool walk beside you one last time."